Hey, good morning. I'm Mike Fowler, Vice President of Professional Services for DFLabs, and I'd like to personally welcome you to today's webinar entitled, How Will GDPR Impact Incident Response and Data Breach Management? As we know, the GDPR was designed to update and replace the Data Protection Directive from 1995. And the General Data Protection Regulation is the most notable change in data privacy regulations for the European Union in over 20 years. The regulation was adopted in April of 2016 and will become fully enforceable throughout the European Union in May of 2018. Now, at its core, the GDPR unifies the data protection regulations of EU members while extending the applicability to foreign companies who process the personal data of EU residents. Now, this is intended to make it much simpler for non-EU business entities to more easily comply with the regulations. However, this clarity comes at a hefty price, and penalties can be assessed in the tens of millions of euros for violations. Now, in order to effectively comply with the upcoming requirements and ensure consistent, repeatable results, we're going to discuss 4 critical areas that will need to be addressed prior to the May 2018 deadline. The first is to understand the beginning steps for personal data protection compliance. The second is to analyze those requirements and ascertain the anonymizing of collected data to protect privacy under the GDPR. We're going to look at how to strengthen your cybersecurity plans by coordinating actions via an incident response platform. And finally, we're going to look at some recommended steps for evaluating requirements for a more completed incident response management plan. We're grateful today to have as our featured presenters 2 industry veterans and innovators, Rebecca Herold and Dario Forte. Rebecca Herold has over 25 years of systems engineering, information security, privacy, and compliance experience. Rebecca is CEO and founder of the Privacy Professor Consultancy, which is established in 2004 and is co-founder and president of SIMBUS LLC. SIMBUS LLC is an information security, privacy, technology, and compliance management cloud service. She's an accomplished author of over 18 books, dozens of book chapter contributions, and hundreds of published articles. Additionally, Rebecca also led the NIST SGIP Smart Grid Privacy Subgroup for 7 years and was a founding member and officer for the IEEE P1912 Privacy and Security Architecture for Consumer Wireless Devices Working Group. Rebecca holds a master's degree in computer science and education. Joining her today is Dario Forte, CEO and founder of DFLabs. Dario Forte started his career in incident response as a member of the Italian police. In that role, he has worked with United States governmental agencies, including the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. He's co-editor of several ISO standards within the 27000 series and holds the CFE, CISM, and CGEIT certifications. Dario has an MBA from the University of Liverpool and has completed select executive curriculum at the Harvard Business School. Following today's webinar, there will be a live question and answer session and follow-up discussion with Rebecca and Dario. Please submit your inquiries via the Ask a Question box, and we will get to as many as possible. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to present to you Rebecca Herold.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today about the need to really start updating and planning for the breach response requirements within the EU GDPR. Now, for most organizations, there's going to be a lot to do between now and next year when the compliance deadline arrives. It's really important that you start preparing and working to meet compliance now and not wait until later. The EU General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, it replaces the Data Protection Directive 9546/EC, and that's been in force since 1995. The GDPR was designed to harmonize data privacy laws throughout Europe and also to protect and empower all EU citizens' data privacy, really reshape the way that organizations across the region approach data privacy. So remember this date that you see on the screen. Any organization that has the personal data of any individual within the EU will need to be in compliance with the GDPR by May 25th of 2018. If you're not, and a GDPR supervisory authority does an audit, you will face large penalties, which I'm going to describe in a few screens. My focus today is going to be on the GDPR breach requirements. However, I want to make sure you realize there are many other requirements and changes from the EU Data Protection Directive as well. So in brief, let me list what those changes are. There's an expanded scope. The new regulation applies to all data controllers and data processors established within the EU and organizations anywhere in the world that target EU citizens. Data protection officers, which you'll hear referenced as DPOs, must be appointed if an organization has systematic monitoring or processes substantial amounts of personal data involving EU citizens. Accountability. Organizations must prove that they are accountable by doing several things: establishing a culture of monitoring, reviewing, and assessing data processing procedures. Also, they need to minimize data processing and retention of personal data. They also need to build in safeguards into their data processing activities. And they also need to document data processing policies, procedures, and operations. And when you get a request from a data protection supervisory authority, you need to make these available right away. Also, there's the need to do privacy impact assessments. Organizations must perform privacy impact assessments, or PIAs, generally when conducting personal data processing. Also, there's the need for consent. Consumer consent to process personal data needs to be freely given by those individuals for specific purposes. Individuals also need to be informed of their right to withdraw that consent. The consent needs to be explicit in the case of sensitive personal data or transborder data flows. There's also mandatory breach notification. Organizations need to notify supervisory authorities of data breaches within 72 hours. And I'm going to be talking about this more in the coming slides. Now, I also want to point out the list of new rights that go beyond the previous Data Protection Directive. There's the right to be forgotten, meaning that individuals have the right to ask data controllers to erase all their personal data without undue delay in certain circumstances. There's also the right to personal data portability. This means that where individuals have provided personal data to a service provider, they can require that provider to port or provide that data to another provider if it is technically feasible. There's also the right to object to profiling, such as the right to not be subjected to decisions based upon automated processing, such as with big data analytics. There's also the requirement for privacy by design. Organizations need to build data protection into the development of business processes and within new systems. Also, privacy settings need to be set at a high level by default. There's also obligations on processors. The GDPR obligations also apply to your third parties, which we call data processors. Processors, who are your contracted third parties, are completely required by the GDPR, and they must also comply with all the requirements. Now, many of my clients have hundreds, and some of them have thousands of such contracted entities. So you really need to make sure that you establish strong vendor management practices, and you need to get started on that now if you haven't already got that in place. Something that's really critical, you need to know and understand what key terms mean in order to be able to effectively comply with the requirements. Now, these are the general definitions from the GDPR. I provided them here to serve as a reference for you after our event today. Now, generally, the organization or the business that is responsible for collecting, using, and so on, the personal data is called the data controller. Any people or other businesses that are contracted to do work for the organization that involves access to the personal data for which the data controller is responsible, those entities are called data processors. And then the individual about whom the personal data is associated is called the data subject. Again, data controllers and data processors must be in full compliance with the GDPR. Personal data is a very wide range of information. Basically, any data that can be associated with a specific individual who's the data subject. Notice that it includes such data as locations, specific physiological characteristics, associated ID numbers, and so on. Each controller and processor needs to know the personal data within its organization. And I'm going to talk about this more on a later slide. Now, a breach is an event where there is unauthorized access to personal data. This unauthorized access can even take place within the controller organization itself. If an employee gets access to personal data who was not authorized to have access to that personal data to support their work responsibilities. So that's something else important to keep in mind. There we go. So now let's dive into the GDPR breach requirements. When the personal data breach is likely to result in high risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals, the controller must communicate the personal data breach to the data subject without undue delay. And this is within 72 hours of discovering the breach. The communication that is made to give notice to the data subject needs to describe in clear and plain language the type and circumstances of the personal data breach. And it has to contain at a minimum some specific types of information items, which I'll cover in an upcoming slide. However, if the controller or the processor can validate any of 3 specific situations that are met, then notice does not need to be made to the data subject. So it's important that you understand what these 3 situations are. The first situation is if the controller or processor has implemented appropriate technical and organizational protection measures and that those measures were applied to the personal data that's affected by the personal data breach. In particular, those types of controls that render the personal data unintelligible to any person who's not authorized to access it. So, for instance, if it was encrypted. The second situation is if the controller or processor has taken subsequent measures after the breach, which will ensure that this high risk to the rights and freedoms of the associated data subjects is no longer likely to materialize. If that's the case, then also notice is not necessary. And then third, if the notice would involve a disproportionate effort. So if you have thousands or maybe millions of personal data records and associated individuals involved. In this case, then there must be instead a public communication or a similar type of measure where the data subjects are informed in an equally effective manner. So maybe you'll put a notice on a TV news announcement, maybe you'll put a post in the newspaper, and so on. If the controller has not already communicated the personal data breach to the data subject, and if the supervisory authority considers that the likelihood of the personal data breach is a high risk to the data subjects, then keep in mind that the supervisory authority may require the controller to provide notice anyway, or the authority may decide that any of these 3 conditions for not providing notice are met. Now, data processors need to notify their data controllers for whom they're performing services whenever a breach occurs. And then also they need to make sure that such determinations of the 3 factors are also done. The data controller, though, is the entity that makes any necessary notice to the associated data subjects and to the supervisory authority. So, what is the breach requirement? Well, every controller and processor needs to know the information on this screen. Processors need to report to their controllers as soon as possible, and then the controllers need to contact their appropriate supervisory authorities within 72 hours of breach discovery. Then if the 3 situations described on the last slide were not met, then they need to notify the data subjects. You need to know who your supervisory authorities are. So you can find information about how to determine them at the link shown on this slide. It depends upon where the individuals, the data subjects, are located. Now, this document I provide a link to describes how to determine the appropriate supervisory authority for your particular situation. So you need to consider the factors that are associated with each breach in order to know who your supervisory authorities are. So now let's dig into more of the details. If I get my slide to forward here. Could you advance the slide for me? For some reason that's not going when I click forward. I should be on slide 8. Uh-oh, I lost my internet connection. Well, that's a bummer. I'm going to hope that you are now on slide 8, and so I will ask you to advance the slides for me as we continue on. So we're on slide 8. I want to dig more into the details. In the case of a personal data breach, the controller must notify the appropriate supervisory authority without undue delay and, where feasible, not later than 72 hours after becoming aware of the breach, unless the personal data breach is unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of those associated natural persons. Where the notice to the supervisory authority is not made within 72 hours, then you need to make sure you accompany the notice with the documented reasons for why you delayed beyond that 72-hour period. Processors need to notify their associated controllers without undue delay after becoming aware of a personal data breach. The notification to the supervisory authority and the data subject needs to include at least all of the following 4 types of information. So first, it needs to include a description of the nature of the personal data breach, including, where possible, the categories and approximate number of data subjects concerned, and also the categories and approximate number of personal data records concerned. So, for example, you might say that a particular web server was hacked, and the names, addresses, and credit card numbers of 1,200 individuals was accessed in an unauthorized manner. The second thing you need to make sure you include is the name and the contact details of the data protection officer or some other contact point within the data controller where the data subjects can then contact them to obtain more information. The third thing is a description of the likely consequences of this personal data breach. So, for example, if it could be used for identity fraud, sold to other crooks, result in damaged credit ratings, and so on, that description needs to be included. And then the fourth is a description of the measures that the data controller and processor, if associated, taken, and what other types of proposed actions are going to be taken by the controller to address this personal data breach, including, where appropriate, the measures that they're going to take to mitigate the breach as possible adverse effects. So, for example, let's say that the controller had a personal data breach. They're going to also offer credit monitoring to set up for the impacted data subjects, or they might also be implementing encryption for all personal data. They might be providing security and privacy training for all employees, and so on. So that's the type of information that you need to include. Now, in the event that it is not possible to provide the information at the same time by that 72-hour time requirement, the information provided by data controllers can be provided in phases without undue further delay. Now, the controller must also document every personal data breach, including all the facts related to the breach, its effects, and also the mitigating actions that were taken. That documentation needs to be maintained, and it must be provided to any supervisory authority that asks to verify compliance with this GDPR breach requirement. On to the next slide, please, slide 9. To meet the GDPR breach requirements, each controller and processor needs to document their breach response and reporting policies and procedures. Now, these should be communicated to the breach response team, and training should be provided to the team. Each controller and processor also needs to determine which of their suppliers and other contracted entities have access to the personal data, and they also need to ensure that they have acceptable documented information security programs and practices in place, including documented policies and procedures, providing training, and doing appropriate risk management activities. Without these, they are more likely to experience breaches. Along with these administrative activities, controllers and processors also need to have implemented appropriate security technologies, including those that are going to help identify when a breach is occurring, such as using intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention system types of tools. Next slide, on to slide 10. Now, if you are not in compliance with GDPR, then you can face some huge penalties. Controllers and processors alike could pay a lot in penalties. However, it's very important for controllers to have oversight of their processors. If data processors are at fault for data breach, then it is the data controller who contracted with them who is on the hook and ultimately accountable for any non-compliance with data protection laws. Although the data processor will be liable to the data controller if that was part of their contract with them. This is another thing that controllers need to ensure is in place, that these requirements for the data processor to share in liability to make sure that they have appropriate policies and procedures are in place. That needs to be within their processor contracts. The GDPR addresses this situation, but it makes a distinction between the maximum fine that data protection authorities will be able to bring against data controllers compared to the data processors for data security failures. A two-tiered sanctions process is used. Breaches of some provisions determined by lawmakers to be the most important for data protection could lead to fines of up to 20 million euro or 4% of the business's global annual revenue for the preceding financial year, whichever is greater. Remember that, whichever is greater. For other breaches, the authorities could fine penalties or could fine companies up to 10 million euro or 2% of the controller's or processor's global annual revenue. Again, whichever is greater. Next slide, please. Slide 11. Now, here's some other recommendations for you to better prevent against breaches, in addition to better responding to breaches that do occur. Your policies and procedures need to document the types of indicators of compromises, or IOC, that cause security breaches in the network, and be prepared to have security policies and procedures in place to defend them. Every organization must also implement security systems such as firewalls and IDS and IPS tools that could help to prevent security attacks. Consider implementing security solutions that can actually instantly detect and alert and report on security breaches. Those are key. Also, the solution should be able to alert in real time whenever any incidents or breach attempts occur. Also, implement security policies that help to ensure data integrity by identifying unauthorized access or access attempts. Monitor the behavior of privileged users, and those are those users who have access to personal data and also other parts of sensitive areas of the network. Do this to identify abnormal activities of them in case of identity theft, and also to be able to report them immediately. Companies should also implement technical security systems that support instant data breach detection wherever possible. The system should also provide in-depth information to speed up the response or to contain that breach at an early stage. Next slide, please, slide 12. So what are the indicators of compromise? Well, basically anything that can point to a possible compromise within your network or systems. Some indicators are very explicit, such as malware, and then others are less obvious, such as file errors. All of these shown on the screen are just a few of the examples of different types of compromise indicators. Next slide, please. Slide 13. Now, over the years, one of the most frequent problems I've seen in organizations is that they did not define the data items that are considered to be personal data within their business environment. If your employees do not know what constitutes personal data, then they will not be able to secure it adequately, and you will experience more privacy breaches. If you have not yet documented the personal data within your organization, then you need to plan to do so soon. You cannot effectively protect personal data if you don't even know what data is considered to be personal data. Sometimes you will include an entire data file as falling under the label of personal data. It varies from organization to organization. Next slide, please, slide 14. After you've determined and documented the types of information items considered to be personal data, you should then identify where all those information items are located. Document the types of devices that house such data and those from which such data is accessed. Now, this list might be very long, especially if your organization embraces and tends to install the latest type of servers and the latest types of handheld devices, such as the new smartphones and tablets and wearables, medical devices if you're in the healthcare space, and even smart Internet of Things types of devices, such as those that are used for tracking and surveillance. Establish a method to keep this inventory updated on a continual basis. Now, this can be done through a combination of manual and automated methods, such as those that I built within my SIMBUS business. Next slide, please, slide 15. So now map the data flows of personal data. You need to do this to identify where the vulnerabilities and threats are located throughout the personal data life cycle. By identifying these, you can then implement safeguards to mitigate the risk. Now, what you see here is an example of a simple data flow that I have used often for most of my privacy impact assessment clients. Now, note, privacy impact assessments are also required under the GDPR. Data flow diagrams do not need to be complicated. So what you should include are primary elements such as the sources of personal data, and the recipients of the personal data, the transmission methods for the personal data, and then the associated safeguards used for each type of transmission. It is much better to prevent breaches than to let them happen and then face potentially huge fines and penalties. So this is an important step to help to prevent those breaches. Next slide, please, slide 16. Now, there are a wide range of possible transmission methods. Don't forget about transmission methods for hard copy forms of personal data. These different transmission methods may have some significant vulnerabilities. Throughout the many PIAs I've performed, I've always revealed through such mapping of the data lifecycle some significant risk because of personal data being transmitted through clear text emails and fax transmissions. That still goes on a lot today. I've also found many instances of clear text personal data actually stored on internet web servers. So you need to have this documented also. Next slide, slide 17. Make sure you document the security associated with each transmission method. Such security can include such things as encryption. Now, if you do note that you are using encryption, make sure you also document the type of encryption. For example, WEP is a very unsecure type of Wi-Fi transmission encryption, and it would be a significant vulnerability. But if you use WPA2, it would be much stronger. So make sure you get this documented. Also, layers of security need to be used. So in addition to encryption, there should also be authentication methods and also non-shared user IDs, physical controls to the devices and to the operation centers and rooms, and so on. Now let's go on to slide 18. So we've discussed the GDPR breach response requirements and how to meet those requirements and ways to prevent breaches. Now I want to step through the thinking and the logic in the event you would have an incident to determine if it is a reportable data privacy breach under GDPR. Now you could use similar types of logic within the steps that you include within your breach response procedures. So before we get started with this example, as a review, under GDPR, a breach of security is an event that leads to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of or access to personal data as it's being transmitted in storage or otherwise processed with no protections to prevent unauthorized access or inadequate protections. Now, in this example now, consider that you have a contracted vendor. This is your data processor. This vendor does all your customer billing for your company. So what if you find out that the vendor had a laptop stolen from their car? Is that a personal data privacy breach that should be reported? Well, guess what? We do not know enough information to determine this yet. So let's go on to the next slide. So what you're going to do is you're going to ask the vendor if personal data was on that laptop that was stolen. Now let's say the vendor says yes, it had the database of your customer's personal data stored upon it. So is this a reportable breach? Well, guess what? We still do not have enough information to know yet. We need to get more information. So what you're going to do, you're going to ask the vendor if the laptop was secured and how it was secured. So let's go on to the next slide, slide 20. So let's say the vendor tells you that, yes, the laptop was secured because it had a boot up password. Well, so is this a breach? Well, having a boot up password is a good and necessary layer of security, but on its own, it is not enough to ensure the personal data stored on the laptop cannot be accessed. Research, as well as real-life incidents, have shown that boot-up passwords are often easy to crack or to get around. You need to get more information still. So let's go to the next slide, slide 21. Now you know that you recently implemented encryption throughout your organization. So that is good. But does this mean that your vendor, the processor, also implemented it. Well, you'd better check. So let's go to the next slide, slide 22. No. You discover that although your organization now requires all of your personal data under your organization's control to be strongly encrypted, your vendor was not a part of that encryption implementation requirements. So you still need to get more information. So you asked your vendor who had the laptop stolen if they had your data encrypted. On to slide 23, please. Well, guess what? You are relieved to find that the vendor used a strong encryption method for your customer billing database. So is this a breach? Yeah, let's just get a little bit more information. You need to do a little bit more checking. Is your vendor practicing good key management practices? You better check. On to slide 24. So you find out that they did not have the decryption keys stored with the laptop, such as within the laptop case, written on a sticky note, or etched into the laptop itself. And hey, I've seen that these situations have actually occurred many times, so you really do need to check. So the stolen laptop had strongly encrypted personal data, and there were good key management practices in place, and it had a boot up password requirement. So under the definition of when a breach is reportable, under the GDPR then, on to slide 25, this was then not a breach. With the security controls in place, the risk is very low that unauthorized access to the personal data on the laptop could occur. So you do not need to give notice. Now keep all of this documentation for each incident. Such documentation is going to be proof that you followed your documented procedures to do a risk analysis, which is basically what we did in a very simplified way to determine the risk level for the incident. In this case, we determined the risk to the associated data subjects was low because it would be very unlikely for the thief to get the laptop booted and then decrypt and access the actual personal data. On to the next slide, slide 26. So my goals today were to provide you with a high-level overview of GDPR, the basic breach and notification requirements under GDPR, along with key definitions of what to include in your breach response procedures, ways to prevent breaches, and then step you through an example incident to show you how to put one type of risk analysis in use for a very common and simple type of incident. Documentation is always key. Make sure you document all your reasoning and why you made your decisions. At the end of our session, we will take questions. And if you think of others after this session, this is my contact information. However, at this time, Dario is going to provide you with more useful information. So Dario, I'm passing it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I'm pleased to have you as a guest today, and I'm happy to hear so much interesting content from your voice. Now, the topic I want to introduce is how GDPR can impact and can be addressed with security automation and orchestration. It is clear, like Rebecca says, and in the meanwhile, I would just to give an overview of what DFLabs is. There is a need of having everything tracked and everything under control, especially when a cyber incident occurs. And that is a very important point to clarify. GDPR and security orchestration and automation, this is what we think, can coexist. But that doesn't mean that all the security automation and orchestration platforms have been built to be compliant and or to support the companies for GDPR. So the way we think that this kind of activity should be performed, of course, is also providing a technology able to answer to the following 4 questions. First of all, what is happening? Second, how they can prioritize the response. how the damage can be contained, and of course, if the breach has occurred elsewhere. While the second, the third, and the fourth question are mostly related to the pure CISO's activity, the first is definitely important because knowing what's happening and being also able to facilitate the creation of the appropriate reporting and documentation ready to be examined and or to be part of the notification process is definitely one of the major GDPR versus CISO priorities at the moment. So if we look at the current automation and orchestration platform, some of them are definitely oriented in pure machine-to-machine automation and are taking care mostly on the resource management versus reaction time. But it's also true that security automation and orchestration versus GDPR can be an enabler for compliance when it comes into the possibility of creating a series, reflecting a series of requirements and a series of benefits that you can see here. Probably the most important in this case is the reduction of the human errors in preparing the documentation. The second is definitely the reaction time that security automation and orchestration can provide. Rebecca was very clearly stating the importance of having everything ready within the 72 hours of the breach, understanding of the breach, but at the same time being effective and also quick in collecting all the data in case of inspections and or just to be ready to prove that every single process has been followed in order to guarantee the compliance is definitely one of the most important tasks for CISO. And it is also clear that nowadays old-fashioned GRC products are not able to provide such a support. So security automation and orchestration in the way we want to present customers is basically devoted to follow the entire spectrum of the incident and breach response, from the pure machine-to-machine automation up to the usage of playbooks and, of course, automated workflow to make sure that all the processes are repeatable and, of course, are proven. In this particular case, there are main requirements that we think should be followed. There are operational capabilities, there are third-party integration needs, there is the need of having accurate reporting and analytics capability. Workflow and case management has an importance, even if we are covering the pure SOC and CSIRT kind of environment. And last but not least, we've spoken about GRC. Such security automation and orchestration technology are not meant to be a replacement for GRC, but of course they must be able to be integrated with that. Only if you have the entire spectrum covered as a CISO in such a technology, you can make a reasonable guess that such an investment in this kind of technology can help you in reaching an achievable rank of compliance with the GDPR. So, for example, especially if you want to have the incidents under control, you may make sure that you have the right dashboard in front of you in order to understand in near real time what kind of incident or what kind of GDPR sensitive events could be probably necessary to cover and or to manage. And when you have an omnicomprehensive single pane of glass, you have the possibility not only to take care of the response process, the triage, the pure technical investigation and remediation process, but you can also laterally take care of the GDPR implication of that. At the same time, you have the possibility to reach this kind of compliance we propose with the help of the playbooks. Playbooks in current security automation and orchestration platforms such as Inkman from DFLabs are standard-based workflow, must be able to provide flexible adaptability on the current policies and procedures that are necessary to be in place in order to guarantee the compliance, but at the same time must be giving the possibility to CISOs to be fast and effective in reacting to incidents. In front of you in this slide, you have an example of it, where basically we have a series of tasks that can be automatically assigned and or applied to humans and machine in case of incidents and or events that needs to be investigated and responded. We have already GDPR compliant type of playbooks. We have a library of over 100 playbooks already available out of the box. And the way we try to help customers in this case is providing playbooks that are already aligned with the most relevant NIST documentation and ISO standards and so on. We strongly believe that this is probably the best way to approach the problem with repeatable, effective, and provable playbooks that can be applied both to process and machine-to-machine actions. So the entire way we handle the technology approach from DFLabs to the GDPR issue is called supervised active intelligence, where machine learning, which is one of our core components of the security orchestration and automation platform from DFLabs, is still being supervised by human, because we think that especially where compliance comes in, humans need to be in the loop, especially when it comes into notification and testification in court. When this problem is potentially there just around the corner, we want to make sure that CISOs, SOC, and incident response team have all the tasks documented, all the audit trail available ready for inspection, and at the same time they can have also the full automation and machine learning support in order to respond to incident in a very quick way and of course in a repeatable manner. Now I think we have space for questions, and then I leave of course everything in the hand of Mike Fowler.
Thanks so much, Dario. And it is indeed time for our question and answer session. Going over the list, we have some really good questions here. Rebecca, we talked about some of the areas where information items that are responsive to GDPR. What are some of the commonly overlooked types of information that may exist on our network?
Oh, great question. And this is something that, first of all, it's hard for organizations to just get it documented, but oftentimes they overlook actually their own employees' information. So you need to think about what's in your employee records that can be associated with your own employees. So you need to make sure that that's included in your definitions. You also need to make sure that you include such things as characteristics that might be associated with a specific individual. That would include such things as their GPS location or also IP address. So you need to think about those as being types of personal data items as well. Too often I find organizations think also that, oh, well, you know, personal data doesn't include name, does it? Because people's names are on the internet and it's publicly available. So just because information is publicly available, don't think that it is not personal information. I mean, it couldn't be further from the truth. Names certainly are types of personal data, even if you can find them online, as are addresses. Always keep in mind that when you're discussing privacy, privacy issues depend upon the context within which personal information is used. So you have to consider names as they are used within the context of your own business activities, because within your own business, those names mean something much different than if you see someone's name online on Facebook or on Twitter and so on. So keep that in mind, and then also the types of unique devices, the wearables and the smart devices that are now becoming more actively used can also create new types of personal data that can be associated with specific individuals. So it depends upon what business your organization is in.
Fantastic, Rebecca, because I know personally sometimes when it comes to the Internet of Things, sometimes I forget about the smaller areas that could definitely be GDPR reportable. We need to make those part of our overall solution. Thank you. Dario, another question that came in is there a standardized way to get comfort on the security state of vendors if they don't have an ISO certification or SSAE 16 or ISAE 3402 SOC 2 report?
The answer is yes or no. The way usually is possible to achieve a reasonable state of third-party control is using an external services able to provide a security ranking and security grade to third parties that are part of the vendor ecosystem of a company. There are a few of them currently working in the market. Their methodology is currently released as a peer-reviewed kind of approach. So while there is no way, no standardized way to do it directly, working with such provider is definitely one of the best way to protect and demonstrate the due diligence in the vendor risk management process.
Well, and if I can interject, that is something that my SIMBUS Vendor Management Services does provide, that type of service as well. So there's a growing number of ways to validate different types of security for different types of vendors.
And that's a fantastic point, which leads into the next question, which revolves around reporting. Who should report an incident to the DPSA when there are multiple data controllers, i.e. Joint controllers?
Is that to either of us, or do you want, I can start if you like.
That'd be beautiful, Rebecca, thanks.
So, yeah, well, you know, when you look at the GDPR, it talks about who has established the relationship with the associated data subjects, so who's ultimately accountable. So if you have multiple data controllers and perhaps they're business partners, or perhaps it goes through some sequence of events to have multiple organizations in mind, who is the one that is ultimately accountable to the data subjects for what happens to their information? Now, of course, each situation will need to be analyzed to determine this. And it's not just a clear-cut answer. Again, it's situational. But you look at who is the entity that ultimately established the initial contact with the data subject, who is the one that communicates with the data subject more often. And in general, that will typically be the one that should report. However, depending again upon the situation, you may have an event where you have more than one controller that's reporting to the supervisory authority. So again, it determines, it depends upon the type of breach and the different factors involved.
Fantastic. So all of this should be determined prior to the incident and made part of your compliance workflow?
Yeah, typically what you would like to have in your documented procedures are different types of decision charts. And in these decision charts, certainly you cannot anticipate every type of breach that could happen. But a decision chart will help you to identify some of the most common types of incidents, and then it can lead you through the logic for determining who should make the contact with your supervisory authority, in addition to the other steps that you need to take. But planning is so important. If you can plan ahead of time what to do, then you won't be caught off guard when a breach occurs and you know, doing like what we're doing here. Well, who should contact? You know, whose responsibility is it? You need to have that all documented within your procedures, and you need to have that documented with your contracts that you have with these other data controllers and certainly your data processors.
And that brings up an excellent point that leads into the next question, is that we know that our compliance solution must contain processes that are repeatable and defensible. And Dario, the question is, how do they know if they're evaluating the right incident response solution that's going to give them the capability to do this?
Well, it's definitely starting from the type of standardization and processes that company have usually inside. Usually, it should be necessary to have a process set up before choosing such a technology. And we think that, for example, comparing the feature and the characteristic of the technologies that are being evaluated with standards such as the ISO 27035, the 27043, and the 30121 could give a sense of the potential compliance of an incident response and management platform in order to satisfy the GDPR general requirements. So just in case, for the audience, the standards that I will definitely suggest to take note of are the ISO 27035, Incident Management, 27043, so Incident Response Investigative Process, and 30121, which is Risk Management applied to forensic and response.
That's fantastic. And is the capability to formulate a decision chart, because there are, so as Rebecca said, so many different variables, does the capability exist to create a decision chart as part of your previously referenced playbook or as part of the workflow involved with compliance?
We think that customers should verify this requirement in order to choose the right technology. A well-designed technology that claims to be helpful for the GDPR should be available to provide the mapping between the two. So it is very important to have the decision chart and the flow exactly designed in order to be, of course, processed in the right way, but at the same time, such a platform should be able to include and map as quickly as possible such processes within a playbook or a workflow, depending from the architecture.
Gotcha. So part of the compliance solution requires you to be able to annotate exactly what your processes is so that they are repeatable and defensible. Is that correct?
Correct. Correct.
Fantastic. I think we've got time for one last question. And Rebecca, is corporate data treated as personal data in the GDPR?
Well, when you're talking about personal data, it doesn't really matter the environment within which it was collected or used. So as I mentioned earlier, you don't forget about your employee data because that's personal data. When you look at that definition that I provided at the beginning, you notice that it talks about any type of data that can be linked to or associated with a specific individual, a data subject. And it does not say only in business, or only outside of business or whatever. So any type of information, even if it's within your organization, if it can be linked to a specific individual, would generally be considered to be personal data. So if I have a business email address that only I use, it's associated with me, that would be a type of personal data item under the GDPR, along with my personal email address I use outside of the situation. Again, a little bit of analysis needs to be done to look at how information is used, but in general, if information can be associated with an individual, that's personal data regardless of it, whether or not it's within the organization or outside.
Gotcha. And again, these workflows and the information mapping needs to be done on or before May 28th, 2018, correct?
Yeah, that's the compliance date. And I want to emphasize, do not wait, and I've seen too many clients do this, don't wait until April. It's going to take you longer than just a few days or even a few weeks to get everything established. And in fact, once you get it established, you want to make sure that you go through and have tabletop exercises with these procedures with your breach response team to make sure that they've actually gone through the steps and that the steps are appropriate and everything is working correctly. Don't just put words on a paper or install technology and think you're ready. I mean, you might meet all of the strict requirements, but if a breach actually then occurs, you may still not be ready if you haven't actually gone through and gotten to know the policies and procedures, tried them out, and know how to actually follow the procedures in a consistent and efficient manner.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, it appears we're out of time at this point. If we wish more information on how to successfully prepare your incident response team for GDPR compliance, please visit us at www.dflabs.com for more information. I want to thank both of our presenters today for their time, and we hope you found the information useful and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Please keep in mind that the questions and material is not to be considered as legal advice by any means, and please consult your corporate counsel in the event you have additional compliance questions. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you at our next presentation. This is Mike Fowler from DFLabs. Thank you and goodbye.